What if the crown didn't fall with a death, but with a decision made in silence? What if the most powerful family in Britain changed overnight, not because of age or illness, but because something was exposed that could no longer be contained? And what if the person at the center of it all wasn't an outsider, a rival nation, or a political enemy, but a prince born into the very heart of the monarchy? Sit with that for a second. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because if even part of this story is true, then what you're about to hear isn't just royal gossip. It's a warning about power, family, loyalty, and the price of crossing an institution that has survived for more than 1,000 years by never forgetting and never forgiving. Picture this. It's an ordinary morning on the surface. The palace gates stand where they always have. Guards are in place. Flags flutter like nothing has changed. But behind the stone walls, something feels wrong. Phones are ringing that shouldn't be ringing. Meetings are happening that were never on the schedule. Advisors are being summoned with one-word messages. Come, now. No announcement. No explanation. Just silence. And silence, in royal terms, is never empty. It's heavy. It means something is being decided without you. Ask yourself this. When was the last time the British monarchy went quiet all at once? Not during celebration. Not during mourning. But during uncertainty. That's the first crack in this story. The moment people started to sense that whatever was unfolding wasn't routine. It wasn't ceremonial. And it wasn't safe. Because within that silence, a word was allegedly spoken that the monarchy hates more than almost any other. Abdication. Not illness. Not temporary withdrawal. Abdication. A word soaked in shame, history, and unfinished business. A word that echoes back to 1936, when another king chose love over duty and nearly shattered the crown in the process. So why would that word resurface now? And why would it resurface with King Charles, a man who waited longer than any monarch in modern history to wear the crown? This is where the story tightens. Because King Charles did not fight for this role. He endured for it. He waited through decades of mockery, impatience, and public doubt. He watched his mother reign longer than anyone imagined possible. He stepped forward not as a conquering hero, but as a man shaped by time, expectation, and restraint. And yet, according to whispered accounts and speculative reconstructions, there came a moment when even that patience wasn't enough. Something tipped the balance. Something forced a question no king ever wants to ask himself. Can the crown survive with me at its center? That question doesn't appear out of nowhere. It arrives when pressure becomes unbearable, when the institution begins to fracture internally, when family drama stops being private and starts becoming dangerous. And this is where another name enters the room. Prince Harry. Now pause. Before opinions kick in, before sides are chosen, before headlines flood your mind. This story is not about whether Harry is right or wrong. It's not about liking him or criticizing him. It's about impact. Because history doesn't care about intentions. It cares about consequences. Harry, the spare. Harry, the rebel. Harry, the prince who walked away and told the world why. For some, he's a symbol of courage. For others, a symbol of betrayal. For the monarchy itself, he represents something far more unsettling. Unpredictability. When Harry left royal duties, it was framed as a break for mental health, independence, and family. But behind palace walls, departures aren't just emotional. They're strategic failures. They're security risks. They're narrative threats. And then came the interviews. The books. The speeches. The moments where private grievances became global conversations. Ask yourself honestly, how does an institution built on silence respond when silence is broken? It doesn't respond publicly. It responds structurally. And according to this unfolding narrative, the response wasn't immediate. It was cumulative. Each revelation, each accusation, each contradiction added weight, until the scale tipped. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to admit. The monarchy doesn't fear scandal. It has survived affairs, abdications, divorces, wars, and revolutions. What it fears is loss of control. Control over the story. Control over the symbols. Control over the idea that the crown stands above personal conflict. And once that idea is threatened, everything becomes negotiable, even kings. So imagine the pressure on Charles. A new reign still finding its footing. A public already skeptical. A family divided in full view of the world. And behind the scenes, advisors asking questions no one wants to answer. Is this sustainable? Can the crown move forward with this level of internal fracture? Or does continuity require a shock so decisive that it resets the board entirely? This is where Prince William enters the narrative in a very different light. Not as the smiling heir at ceremonies, not as the dutiful son, but as a contingency plan. William has always been prepared for kingship in theory. Educated, coached, trained from childhood. But preparation is not readiness. Readiness comes when you are forced to choose between what you want and what the institution demands. And according to speculative accounts, that moment came far sooner than anyone expected. Because if Charles was hesitating, if the crown was wobbling, then succession was no longer a distant future. It was an emergency solution. And emergencies don't wait for emotional closure. Now let's talk about the word that dominates this entire story. Betrayal. It's a loaded word. Dangerous. Emotional. Subjective. But institutions define betrayal differently than families do. For a family, betrayal is emotional harm. For a monarchy, betrayal is destabilization. The allegation, the suggestion, the rumor that changed everything wasn't just about hurt feelings or embarrassing stories. It was about exposure, about revealing mechanisms that were never meant to be seen, about challenging the moral authority of the crown itself. If that sounds vague, it's because vagueness is where power hides. What matters isn't whether every claim is true. What matters is how those claims were perceived inside the palace. Perception is reality when survival is at stake. And in that reality, a line was allegedly crossed. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. And once crossed, it couldn't be uncrossed. So imagine the conversations that followed. Advisors weighing optics versus stability. Courtiers debating loyalty versus damage control. A king facing the unthinkable choice between blood and crown. And somewhere in those conversations, a conclusion began to form. If the monarchy was going to survive the next decade, it needed clarity, authority, a single voice, a clean narrative. And that narrative could not include a rogue prince with global reach and nothing left to lose. Which brings us to the most shocking claim of all, that Charles didn't fall. He stepped aside, not in weakness, but in calculation. Because abdication, when framed as sacrifice, can be spun as strength, as duty, as putting country and crown above personal pride. And if that abdication cleared the path for William, then the monarchy could present renewal instead of collapse. A new king, a new era, a firm line drawn. And that line, allegedly, had a name attached to it. Harry, not banishment in the medieval sense. No guards escorting him to the edge of the kingdom. No proclamations nailed to palace doors. But something colder. Symbolic exile. Removal from influence. From proximity. From relevance to the institution's future. Because in modern royalty, power isn't about where you live. It's about whether your voice matters. And the suggestion is that William's first unspoken order as king wasn't about ceremony or tradition. It was about containment. If you're feeling unsettled, that's intentional. Because this story isn't about crowns and castles. It's about how systems respond when challenged from within. About how quickly love becomes liability when power is threatened. And here's the final question you need to hold on to as we move forward. If this is what happens when a prince speaks out, what does that say about the institution he left behind? The morning began like any other, or at least, it looked like it did from the outside. The iron gates of Buckingham Palace swung open and closed with the familiar precision. Guards stood at their posts, their expressions as stoic as always. From the public square, life seemed ordinary. Tourists took selfies, buses trundled past, pigeons cooed in the crisp air. But inside those walls, something was very, very wrong. It started with the phones. Advisors, aides, private secretaries. Phones rang incessantly in rooms where they were never supposed to ring at such hours. Some were left unanswered. Others triggered rushed meetings in dimly lit chambers. The palace had a rhythm, a tempo, a sense of timing that had been refined over centuries. And that morning, the rhythm was broken. Emergency messages went out. One-word instructions. Come, now. The kind of messages that never go to the public, that never leave behind a paper trail. Instructions that signal not routine, not ceremony, not celebration, but a crisis. And yet, the public would remain unaware. That's how the monarchy survives, by controlling the narrative before the narrative controls them. Imagine being one of the staff members witnessing this. Some had been at the palace for decades. They were used to chaos. The queen's passing had brought a storm of activity. But this was different. There were whispers in corridors that usually echoed only protocol. Advisors whispered in hushed tones about something no one could yet name aloud. Others huddled in corners, talking about events that hadn't reached the media, events that could reshape the monarchy itself. And then came the silence. Silence, in royal terms, is louder than any proclamation. A paused statement, a canceled engagement, an unexplained absence from a scheduled event. The public sees nothing and thinks nothing is wrong, but insiders know. Something is happening behind closed doors. Something critical. Something irreversible. This wasn't the first time a royal crisis had gripped the palace, of course. The abdication of Edward VIII, the fallouts from Diana's tragic death, the scandals surrounding Prince Andrew, all had their moments. But there was a difference here. The difference was in the energy, the urgency, the unspoken dread. Even the most seasoned courtiers could feel it. They knew something was on the verge of breaking. At the center of this storm was King Charles, a man who had waited decades for the crown, patient, cautious, and endlessly measured. He had endured public skepticism, media scrutiny, and the long shadow of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. He had prepared for kingship meticulously, quietly, methodically. He understood tradition better than almost anyone. But the events of that morning seemed to suggest that preparation wasn't enough, that the weight of the crown was shifting under his hands in ways he hadn't anticipated. And then there was Prince William. He was the heir apparent, yes, the future king, groomed and ready in theory, but William had never been thrust into the kind of immediate, urgent decision-making that this morning required. The monarchy's continuity was not just at stake. The family itself was teetering on the edge of fracture. And at the heart of it was a brother whose actions had apparently destabilized everything. Prince Harry. He had left, stepped back, and carved his own path in the world, ostensibly seeking independence, freedom, and a voice outside the palace walls. But influence isn't measured by presence, it's measured by reach. And Harry's reach had grown. Every interview, every public comment, every book or statement added pressure behind the stone walls of Buckingham. What might have been an emotional choice for a son suddenly became a potential crisis for an institution. Ask yourself, what happens when the most powerful family in the United Kingdom is faced with internal exposure? When a member of that family threatens, intentionally or not, the perception of unity and authority. History tells us that the monarchy responds with precision, silence, and, when necessary, decisive action. On that morning, the weight of the decision was tangible. Meetings that would normally last 30 minutes extended for hours. Advisors debated the balance between public perception and private stability. Security staff updated contingency plans that no one outside the inner circle would ever know existed. Courtiers discussed outcomes that could lead to permanent family division, or worse, institutional damage. And in all of this, Charles sat at the center, silent, measured, calculating. His face, seen through occasional glimpses by senior aides, revealed none of the turmoil inside. But insiders who had worked with him for decades later recounted the tension in the air, the way even small gestures seemed charged with unspoken questions. His mind, they said, was turning over scenarios like a chess master predicting moves not yet made. The day passed, each hour more tense than the last. The normal rhythms of palace life. The ceremonial routines, the media statements, the public-facing engagements, halted in quiet succession. Every canceled event was a signal. Every delayed announcement a potential signal of deeper upheaval. By mid-afternoon, rumors began to circulate among staff. Meetings were being held that bypassed normal chains of command. Decisions traditionally made collectively were being concentrated in a smaller circle. The word abdication started to drift through the corridors. Not officially, but whispered in cautious tones. It's a word that carries history, scandal, and shame. One can imagine that even saying it aloud felt dangerous, yet necessary. Why abdication? Why now? The suggestion is that a combination of factors had pushed Charles to consider an option previously unimaginable, stepping aside voluntarily, not in weakness, but as a strategic maneuver. The monarchy, after all, is not only about the ruler, it's about survival. And when survival is threatened, personal ambition or hesitation is often set aside. In parallel, the presence of Prince William loomed large. Always in the shadows, he had trained for kingship his entire life. But readiness is different from necessity. That morning, it was necessity that thrust him forward. The decision to accelerate his ascension, if indeed it was accelerated, would not just be a ceremonial choice. It would be a statement. Authority had to be consolidated, and continuity demanded a decisive hand. Meanwhile, Harry's absence became an element of tension, not relief. The prince who had walked away and spoken publicly about the family, about grievances, struggles, and perceived injustices, was now indirectly influencing the direction of the monarchy simply by existing outside its walls. Every public statement, every interview, every private leak of opinion became pressure on a system designed to withstand centuries of external threats, but not necessarily internal exposure. As the evening descended over London, the palace's exterior remained calm, almost serene. Guards stood in the familiar positions. The public, for the most part, remained unaware. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation, fear, and uncertainty. Decisions were being weighed that would change the line of succession, redefine family bonds, and alter the public perception of the monarchy forever. If you're wondering how the institution can survive under such pressure, the answer is by controlling the narrative before anyone else controls it. And in this case, the narrative was already slipping. Leaks, public speculation, and social media chatter threatened to shape the story before the palace could. Every hour that passed without a statement allowed speculation to grow, tension to escalate, and perception to solidify in the public mind.